The golden age of America begins right now. Declarations like this rarely appear during moments of uncertainty. They emerge when power feels settled, when success feels earned rather than temporary, and when decline still sounds abstract instead of measurable. History, unfortunately, offers very little reassurance at precisely that stage. Beneath the confidence, another shift had already taken shape. It unfolded quietly, attracted little attention, and yet shaped everything built above it. That shift did not announce itself with crisis or collapse, which meant it went largely unchallenged. As manufacturing receded, finance expanded to occupy the space it left behind. That substitution changed the structure of the economy itself. Capital no longer moved primarily into factories, equipment, or skilled labor. Instead, it flowed into assets, leverage, and financial instruments valued for their returns rather than for their output. The result was subtle at first, then structural. Banks gradually stopped prioritizing lending that built productive capacity. Credit increasingly amplified speculation rather than creation. Corporations mirrored the shift, discovering that profits arrive faster through buybacks, mergers, and balance sheet engineering than through long-term innovation. This is where the divergence began to matter. The economy continued growing, yet lived experience did not keep pace. Markets climbed while wages stagnated, asset prices rose while productivity flattened, and wealth accumulated through ownership rather than work. What followed was a system that rewarded capital holders while steadily punishing those dependent on income. None of this happened by accident. For decades, policy choices tilted incentives toward financial returns instead of industrial resilience, and that tilt reshaped behavior across the system. Cheap credit encouraged leverage, deregulation accelerated risk-taking, and global capital mobility rewarded speed rather than durability. The result looked impressive on paper, but the structure underneath remained fragile. History has seen this pattern before. In late Republican Rome, wealth migrated away from agriculture toward land speculation and debt extraction, hollowing out the productive base long before political authority cracked. 18th-century Britain followed a similar path as overseas financial profits began to eclipse domestic manufacturing investment. In each case, decline started quietly inside the economy before appearing in institutions. The United States moved along that same trajectory. As capital chased higher returns, supply chains stretched farther and production scattered outward, which meant resilience declined even as efficiency increased. Redundancy disappeared, flexibility faded, and when shocks finally arrived, adaptation slowed. That vulnerability did not remain theoretical for long. Crises made the weakness visible. Supply disruptions revealed a dependence that had gone unnoticed for decades, while inflation exposed how thin the margin for error had become. Rising interest rates then pulled back the curtain completely, showing how much stability depended on cheap money rather than real output. The problem was not one event, but accumulation. At the same time, institutions built to manage long-term risk shifted toward short-term performance, and that shift compounded the strain. Political cycles shortened, corporate leadership focused on quarterly outcomes, and public trust was eroded as results diverged from promises. This drift mattered more than any single policy choice. Empires rarely fall from one catastrophic mistake. They weaken when feedback loops fail, incentives misalign, and warnings no longer trigger correction. And this is where systems lose their ability to adapt. China's system, for all its flaws, avoided several of these traps. Long planning horizons guided capital allocation, which meant infrastructure projects accepted delayed returns rather than immediate payoff. Industrial policy aligned investment with production instead of speculation, keeping output central even when mistakes occurred. The direction stayed consistent, and over time, the contrast sharpened. While American capital rotated through financial markets, Chinese capital accumulated in physical systems that could not be easily reversed. While United States policy prioritized consumption stability, China emphasized output capacity and redundancy. And while one system optimized flexibility, the other optimized endurance. Neither model guaranteed success. Only one reduced fragility. History suggests endurance matters more than efficiency during transitions, especially when confidence begins to erode. Systems dependent on belief alone struggle under stress, while systems anchored in production, logistics, and savings absorb shocks more effectively. This distinction defines the current transition. Rebuilding productive capacity takes years, which means delay compounds the cost. Rewiring incentives takes even longer, requiring coordination, sacrifice, and patience. None of those traits come easily during periods of polarization and debt dependence. The longer adaptation waits, the sharper it becomes. Past empires learned this lesson under pressure rather than choice. When correction finally arrived, options narrowed, costs surged, and stability broke suddenly instead of gradually. That same risk now hangs over the current order. So the question is no longer whether change is coming. The question is whether adaptation arrives early enough to soften the landing or late enough to amplify the shock. History leaves that answer unresolved, but it never hides the pattern. Every dominant power moves through the same sequence. Expansion creates wealth. Wealth creates obligations. Obligations demand control. And control eventually costs more than the system can support. The symbols change, but the mechanics remain intact. For much of the 20th century, the United States occupied a position unlike any before it. With roughly 4% of the global population, American households and institutions absorbed close to 20% of global income, a concentration unmatched in modern history. Military dominance followed the same imbalance, with nearly 40% of global defense spending flowing through Washington. That scale reshaped the world. Trade rules bent toward American priorities, financial markets priced risk through the dollar, and alliances formed with United States approval functioning as an assumption rather than a condition. Power at that level alters behavior long before it declines. When dominance persists long enough, leaders stop treating it as conditional and begin treating it as permanent. Decision-making shifts toward preservation rather than positioning. Warning signs lose urgency and tolerance for risk rises. That mental shift always arrives before visible strain. The move away from this order unfolded quietly, then accelerated. By the late 2020s, China is positioned to surpass the United States as the world's largest economy, not through a dramatic leap, but through decades of preparation measured outside election cycles. Since 2010 alone, more than $1 trillion flowed outward from Beijing into ports, rail networks, power systems, logistics hubs, and digital infrastructure across multiple continents. These projects avoided ideology, avoided military force, and avoided spectacle. Influence did not require attention, it required permanence. Each port anchored future trade, each rail line shaped supply routes, and each power plant locked in dependency. Contracts replaced treaties, infrastructure replaced bases, and influence arrived without fanfare. While this expansion unfolded abroad, pressure accumulated at home. Federal debt climbed past $36 trillion, and interest payments alone absorbed roughly 1 out of every 6 federal dollars before any services were funded. Budget flexibility narrowed, policy options shrank, and the open trade system that once amplified American power fractured under tariffs and reversals. Confidence followed the same trajectory. Allies recalculated commitments. Markets reacted instantly to political signals, and rules that once anchored expectations shifted from assumptions into bargaining tools. Stability gave way to negotiation, and predictability disappeared. This sequence does not belong to one leader or one party. It belongs to late-stage dominance. To understand how this point emerged, the clock has to move backward. In the early 1990s, the idea of American decline sounded implausible, almost absurd. The Soviet Union collapsed, removing the only rival capable of matching United States power across military, political, and ideological dimensions. By the mid-1990s, the dollar accounted for more than 70% of global foreign exchange reserves. Energy markets settled trades in dollars, international debt priced risk in dollars, and entire economies stored value in dollar-denominated assets. American influence embedded itself directly into the global system. Across the Pacific, however, a different trajectory took shape. China converted population into production at a scale unmatched in modern history, pulling rural labor into industrial zones clustered near ports. Manufacturing ecosystems thickened year after year, and growth exceeded 9% a year for decades. Hundreds of millions exited subsistence living as output scaled and costs fell. Washington encouraged this integration. China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2000 accelerated trade flows, and exports to the United States surged. Within 15 years, shipments exceeded $1.5 trillion, reinforcing the belief that integration would reshape political behavior. What no one planned for was permanence. Factories did not return, supply chains did not rebalance, and capital hardened in place offshore. Skills clustered abroad, dependence deepened quietly, and low prices masked structural change. Wages failed to keep pace, consumption expanded anyway, and debt filled the gap. Household borrowing rose from under $2 trillion in 2000 to more than $5 trillion by 2020, while government debt accelerated even faster than productive output. This configuration has appeared before, and the ending rarely surprises historians. The Dutch Republic followed a similar path, financing prosperity through borrowing, relying on imports, and allowing inequality to widen. Trade dominance faded first, financial strain followed, and political power eroded last. China avoided that structure. Consumption remained restrained, savings stayed elevated, and capital flowed into rail, ports, power grids, shipyards, and industrial capacity. By 2023, household savings exceeded $19 trillion, roughly $57,000 per person, supporting long-term investment rather than short-term relief. Those funds did not remain within national borders. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, more than 150 countries received Chinese financing for infrastructure that bound trade routes directly to Beijing for decades. The United States pursued influence differently. Since 2000, involvement in more than 70 foreign conflicts consumed trillions of dollars, expanding military presence while infrastructure investment lagged behind. At home, the industrial backbone thinned as manufacturing employment fell from nearly 1 in 3 workers in the mid-20th century to roughly 8% by 2020. Output continued rising on paper, but wealth concentrated upward. The top 1% came to control roughly 30% of national assets, while incomes at the bottom barely moved. Housing amplified the divide, with prices rising more than 500% since the 1980s, pushing ownership out of reach. By the mid-2020s, frustration hardened into backlash. Voters demanded reversal rather than reform, and tariffs became the symbol of restored strength. Markets responded immediately, bond investors pulled back, and borrowing costs threatened to rise. Even a single percentage point increase implied hundreds of billions in additional annual debt service. This is how transitions begin. Empires do not collapse in one moment. They strain, adapt, and retreat from the systems they built, mistaking control for resilience. One model now borrows to sustain consumption, while the other saves, builds, and waits. History is clear about direction. Power migrates toward those who invest patiently and away from those who consume on credit. What remains uncertain is not whether the balance shifts, but how disruptive the transition becomes once confidence alone can no longer hold the system together.